Hi, Jonas and Cam. It's Auntie Sarah. I have a really special book for you today, and we might get a surprise visitor, but we'll see. So, the book we're reading today is called Bobbie the Wonder Dog, a true story. So, keep that in mind when I'm reading that this is a true story. And this was written by Tracy Brown and illustrated by Carrie Porter. You know how we got this book? Tracy Brown, the author, came to Max's school, read the book, and even signed the book for Max, said, "To Max, a good reader," from Tracy Brown. So this is a long book. You may need to watch it in 2 or even 3 parts today or later. All right. So it's probably a book too where I will show you pictures and then I will read because it's long pages. Now, we also have a special guest. Maybe I can change this. Because you see this dog here? Who does that dog look like? Just a little bit. Let's see. Django's here too. Alrighty. What is happening? Bluetooth needs to be off. Okay. Make sure the speakers are good. Okay, so let's get started with Bobbie the Wonder Dog. Remember, it's a true story that happens in Oregon where we live. All right, so here's Bobbie. He's on his truck. Here we go. Bobbie was going on vacation just as his favorite man finished securing the luggage. The mixed breed collie, which is exactly the same breed as Django, jumped up in one easy leap. Django is a big leaper and jumper. This would be his riding place. "Let's go, Bobbie," seemed to say, wagging his stumpy tail. On the hot summer day in 1923, he didn't know that he was leaving on a trip of a lifetime. Bobbie couldn't know that the next year he, just a regular dog from a regular farm dog from Silverton, Oregon, would be famous. Today, all he cared about was the ride with his people. So he's getting ready. So 1923, that is a long time ago. And Silverton, Oregon is just south of where we live. All right, here's some good pictures to look at Bobbie and his little friends there. So let's read about this. Bobbie's people were Frank and Elizabeth Brazier, their daughters Leona and Nova. 2 years earlier, Frank had decided their farm needed a farm dog. He went to the neighbors to inspect a new litter. There, in the pile of 6-week-old fluff balls, one yipped for Frank's attention. Something about the pup was different. "How about that? He's got a bobbed tail," Frank said, picking up the puppy. "I'll take him." And that's how Bobbie got his name and a home. So a bobbed tail, we'll look in this picture, means it's shorter. See how this doggy here has a long tail? That one's like Django's, a really long one with a white tip. But Bobbie has a little short bobbed tail. So here he is on the farm with Frank the farmer. On the farm, Bobbie was a spunky puppy and a natural healer, which is the way that dogs manage the sheep and the cows and other things on there, nipping at the heels of cows, cats, and even people to make them go where he wanted. Jonas, you ask your mommy about our dog Kippers, who was a blue healer, and she used to heal your mom and me and Auntie E. But one time, a stubborn horse kicked at Bobbie. Even with a bad cut above his eye, little Bobbie pestered that horse into the corral. Just months later, Bobbie had another close call when his leg was run over by a tractor. That'll leave another scar, Frank said, as he gently bandaged the wound. As soon as he could walk again, Bobbie eagerly went back to work. There was no stopping Bobbie. So Bobbie didn't just lay around like Django in his dog bed or the couch or my chair. he worked, and you can see the bandage on his leg right there. All right, there's another picture. When the Brazers decided to quit farming and run a restaurant in town, they didn't know what to do about Bobbie. A herding dog needs to be on a farm, Frank said, but inside he was thinking, how can I sell my best friend? You know what? Also ask your mom about our dog Kippers, because she lived at our house in the city for a little while, but then we had to give her to a ranch so she could work and stop herding and nipping at the three girls. We have to do what's best for Bobbie, Elizabeth said. They decided it was best to leave him on the farm with the new owners, where he could run free and continue herding. Saddened, the family gave Bobbie extra pets and snacks and belly rubs. When they left Bobbie behind, he was sad too. Poor Bobbie. Days later, Bobbie ambled into the restaurant as if to say, hey, didn't you forget somebody? Ambled means walked kind of slowly, and here he is at the restaurant that the Brazers now own. Look, he just busts in. Ah, Bobbie, you can't be here, Frank said as he stroked the dog's head. People don't want fur in their food. He took the young dog back to the farm. But a few days later, Bobbie was back. We need to talk, Elizabeth said to Frank. That evening, the country people and the town people reached an agreement. On weekdays, Bobbie would work on the farm, and on weekends, he'd stay in town. And Bobbie agreed too. That seems like a good plan. All right, so here we are back to the present story where Bobbie is on his road trip. So he's sitting on the back of the car, and you can see this is the state of Oregon. They're going to go through Idaho and Wyoming and Nebraska. You know about Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, all the way to Indiana. That is a really far way. The idea worked for a while, but by summer, Frank and Elizabeth missed Bobbie terribly, so they brought him back from the farmer for 3 times more than they had sold him for. When August rolled around, they planned a trip back to their old hometown, with Bobbie, of course. The trip from Silverton, Oregon to Wolcott, Indiana was 2,551 miles. Days and days of driving on unpaved auto rails. Bobbie was in dog heaven. So back then they didn't have paved roads, they didn't have highways, so you're going to hear about Bobbie's adventure. He was in heaven from his perch. He scanned the horizon like a king inspecting his domain. There is happy Bobbie. And look, that's how they got across the country. Just ambling along on the dirt track. And there's Bobbie chasing a bunny rabbit. In 1923, there were no highways. The dirt roads were dusty, narrow, and bumpy, and the cars moved a lot slower. Often, the Brazier's car was the only one around. Through the long days, Bobbie entertained himself. If he spotted a rabbit, he launched off the car and raced after it. Sometimes an hour would pass before he would return to the road. As Bobbie neared, Frank would slow down a bit so he could hop aboard. Bobbie sure makes a long road trip more fun, doesn't he? Frank said to Elizabeth. Elizabeth smiled and nodded. The Braziers never worried. No matter how far away their dog ran, no matter how tired he got, he always found his way back. There was no stopping Bobbie. I could tell you a story about our old dog, Heidi, who was lost for hours and hours in the woods in Minnesota, but she came back, luckily, right on the day we were headed back to drive back to Oregon. Through the Rocky Mountain passes. Hey, you know about the Rocky Mountains, don't you? The Braziers drove east, sending up clouds of dust. Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois. And at last, Elizabeth read a border sign. Indiana, we're almost there. So there they are, riding along through the whole countryside. Okay, now this is where the adventure really begins. At last, the dusty car pulled into a house full of relatives. Bobbie wiggled and licked as his people hugged and shook hands. Then Frank checked his watch. "I'm going to gas up the car now while I can," he said. "Back soon. Let's go, Bobbie." At the filling station, Bobbie slipped off and looked around. Suddenly, Frank saw him racing around the corner, chased by a pack of snarling dogs. Frank shook his head. "Bobbie knows his way out of trouble," he thought. "He won't be long." The tank was filled, the bill was paid, and Frank was still waiting. He tooted his car horn. That usually worked. He cupped his hands and called, "Let's go, Bobbie." Nothing. "He's probably gone back to the house," Frank thought. Okay, so here they are, 2,500 miles, so 2,551 miles away from home. Their first night, and Bobbie gets chased by a pack of dogs. But Bobbie wasn't back at the house. The anxious couple drove around town that evening, honking and calling Bobbie's name until midnight. In the morning, Frank placed a newspaper ad. He was desperate. They had to continue their trip soon. They promised to visit more family in other towns. "He'll probably show up the minute you leave," their relatives assured him. "We'll keep him until you come back through." "Sure," said Frank, but inside he was worried. Where was Bobbie? Nearly a month later, when Frank and Elizabeth returned to Walcott, there was still no sign of Bobbie. "Maybe he's all right," Elizabeth said tearfully. "Maybe someone adopted him." Miserable, the Braziers headed home without their beloved pet. How would they tell their girls that Bobbie was lost, or worse, could he be dead? So here's that first night where they're looking around for him. Luckily there was a full moon, and now they're headed back to Oregon without their doggie. That would have made us really sad if we had to go home without Heidi. But Bobbie's not dead, I can assure you that. Bobbie is up for the adventure of a lifetime. And here it says, Bobbie wasn't dead, although in the weeks and months that followed, he would face great danger, and he hadn't been adopted, though several families would try to make him their pet, and he certainly wasn't lost. As it turns out, Bobbie knew exactly where to go. He had decided to walk back home to Oregon, and there was no stopping Bobbie. So Bobbie's on his way home. Probably that night he just turned around and went back home toward Oregon, and they didn't even think to look in that direction. So he's going through the rain and the snow. Let's see what happens. Bobbie walked nearly 3,000 miles that fall and winter. That means he was out in the winter in the mountains. You know how cold that can be. Crossing fast rivers and windy mountain passes, he walked through sunshine, rain, and snow. He chased rabbits and other critters, but for food this time, not for fun. He stopped at a farmhouse along the way, weary and thirsty, but he never stayed for long. All right, so now look. What does it look like's happening here? We'll find out. On February 15th, 1924, exactly 6 months after Bobbie was lost in Indiana, Nova and a friend were strolling downtown Silverton when they noticed an old mangy dog limping ahead of them. There was something familiar about that dog, something about his tail. Could it be? Then Bobbie spotted Nova and raced at her. She dropped to her knees and he licked her face, making small, happy cries that said, "I can't believe it's you. I found my people." Nova followed as Bobbie rushed into the restaurant like a whirlwind. After a short, joyful hello to Elizabeth and Leona, Bobbie streaked upstairs to find Frank, who was sleeping after his night shift. Now, if you look closely, Nova's pretty excited, but Bobbie looks a little worse for the wear. He looks old and skinny and hobbly. And here he is, finding Frank. Bobbie leaped onto the bed, paws on Frank's shoulder, whining and crying and covering his face with kisses. Am I dreaming? Frank thought. Is it possible? The dog's feet were raw and bleeding, and his nails worn down to the nubs. He was so skinny and dirty, his fur so badly matted. Frank hardly recognized him, but there was the scar from the horse hoof and the one from the tractor. It's a miracle! Bobbie gratefully drank some water and lay next to Frank and slept for hours. Later, Frank fed him a thick sirloin steak and a pint of cream. Bobbie rolled on his back and held up his wounded pads as Frank tenderly wiped on the medicine. For days, Bobbie slept and ate and slept as he healed. There he is eating that fancy steak. All right, so here's the last page and a bunch of more information that I will read to you. Bobbie's unbelievable story quickly spread across Silverton and then Oregon and across all of America in newspapers. Letters arrived from strangers. We sounded the horn and the dog ran up and jumped into the car as if it was his own, one said. Another wrote he seemed to know where he was going. So these are people who spotted Bobbie along his journey. Here and there, Bobbie had accepted a meal or a night's stay at one house. He'd search every room before eating and move on. He was looking for his people. Some had wanted to adopt him, but he chewed through a rope or slipped away out of a new collar. Listen to this, Frank said, reading to his wife. He always was looking for someone, always in a hurry. Frank reached out to pet Bobbie, who panted and offered a dog smile. As we all know, Elizabeth said, there's no stopping Bobbie. Bobbie curled up at his feet, and he was home for good. And there he is, sitting there with his baseball bat and another bandaged foot. Now, here is the true story of this dog, Bobbie. Born in 1921, and he lived until 1927. The big Scotch collie belonging to Mr. and Mrs. G.F. Brazier, proprietors of the Leo Lunch restaurant in this city, surprised his owners one day this week when he showed up at their place of business after an absence of 6 months. That's from the Silverton Appeal, which is a newspaper, on February 23rd, 1924. Bobbie's remarkable journey thrilled readers around the country who wanted to know more about the Wonder Dog. The Oregon Humane Society in Portland investigated and confirmed that he had traveled about 2,800 miles on foot. They presented Bobbie with a silver medal and the keys to the city. Letters and presents poured in daily. Frank wrote about him in Animal Pals, a book of dog stories, and Bobbie starred in a silent movie. Bobbie's feet even appeared in Ripley's Believe It or Not. Bobbie got so famous that 1 week-long appearance, more than 100,000 people showed up to pet him. In April of 1925, Bobbie became a parent with another collie named Tippy. She gave birth to 16 puppies, all boys, and Bobbie made headlines again. When Bobbie died 2 years later, hundreds attended his funeral, and Portland Mayor George L. Baker gave the eulogy. After Rin Tin Tin, the dog star of 27 Hollywood movies, arrived with a wreath. Wow. In 1923, Silverton hosted its first pet parade in honor of Bobbie, and his son Pal leading the way. Every summer since, the town has celebrated with a parade and a Bobbie look-alike contest. Maybe we should enter Django. Bobbie's castle is a red and white doghouse that stands over his burial place at the Oregon Humane Society Cemetery, and a statue and a 70-foot mural in Silverton play tribute to this famous dog. So here is an actual picture of Frank and Bobbie right there. And then this is the little doghouse. So this one says, Bobbie posed for publicity photos with Frank. And this one says the Brazier's granddaughter, Vilna Crockett, visited Bobbie's castle where the famous dog is buried. So that is the story of Bobbie the Wonder Dog. True story. Maybe next time you're here in Oregon, we can go visit his famous doghouse or look for that mural. All right, Jonas and Cam, that was a long one. I hope you enjoyed it. We love you. Bye-bye.